So again, I thank you for joining. Is my high school student eligible for the Regional Center, a Connections California presentation? Connections California is an online resource and information hub for transition to adulthood and adult services with PHP, Parents Helping Parents. And we have an e-learning library, live events like these, and e-packets full of information and other resources. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce this evening's speaker. Jim Huyck has assisted over 700 families and their loved ones with disabilities as they navigate through various public benefits, including regional centers, SSI, SSDI, Medi-Cal, Medicare, and IHSS. Before becoming a public benefits consultant, Jim served as executive director of the Alta, California Regional Center in Sacramento, and as a rehabilitation counselor with the California State Department of Rehabilitation and Associate Dean of Special Education for the San Diego Community College District. So when we were thinking of this topic, I thought no one better than Jim to discuss it with us. And he'll give an overview of regional centers and individual IPPs and the services that regional centers provide, with a nod toward how regional center eligibility works when you're a youth or a young adult. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing now and turn it over to Jim. Thanks, Jim.
Okay, so now I should be able to go to share screen. And okay, can you see that?
There we go. We're off and running. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Alyssa, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. First slide just gives you my name and my title and my contact information in case you should need that. And what we're going to be talking about tonight is the regional center services for consumers with developmental disabilities. And as Alyssa mentioned, I was executive director of one of the regional centers for 10 years. That was in the Sacramento Regional Center called Alta, California Regional Center. And so a little bit of background on the regional centers. A lot of people think that they're state agencies. They're not. They're private nonprofit corporations. They were created back in the 60s, actually, under the Lanterman Act. Frank Lanterman was the legislator, a Republican of all things. You don't usually think of Republicans developing massive social service delivery systems, but it was a Republican. Frank Lanterman was the instigator of 2 pilot regional centers to see if this would work. And there was one in the north called that became Golden Gate Regional Center, and the one in the south later became Lanterman Regional Center. And it really was a result of parents saying there's got to be something better than having our family members placed into institutions. And so the parents would literally corner Frank Lanterman in the Senate building in Sacramento and say, we need to have something better than what there is currently. And so that's why he piloted or passed the legislation to pilot the regional center system in the north and the south. And at that time, it only served individuals with what was called then mental retardation. It's intellectual disabilities now, but it did not serve all of the disabilities that are currently served by regional centers. Again, regional centers are not state agencies. They're 21 regional centers. They contract with the State Department of Developmental Services. So that's the link to the state, is through DDS, Department of Developmental Services. And they provide or coordinate services and supports for individuals with developmental disabilities. They do not provide direct service. They pay for direct service through a whole labyrinth of vendors, hundreds and hundreds of vendors that provide the actual services to the consumers. Here's a map that shows the breakdown of the 21 regional centers across the state. And you can see in your folks' area, in the Bay Area there, you can see the regional centers. The more metropolitan areas, there's an insert for Los Angeles, for instance, that has a number of regional centers. And then there's the rural areas that have very large catchment areas, and they have to deliver services in a little bit different way because there's not as many vendors in those areas. So there can be quite a difference between services in and the availability of services in some regional centers than in others. And actually, that was the philosophy about creating regional centers and not having them state agencies. I hope it don't offend anyone who's a state employee out there, but they said it was too important, too important a job to be left to the state. And so that's why they did it through private nonprofit corporations. So what is the eligibility for regional centers? As I said before, it was just for the intellectually disabled, but now it has expanded, and I'll go into those in a moment. But the eligibility is determined solely on meeting the definition of being developmentally disabled. There's no income, there's no asset test, although there have been some fees that have been introduced recently. We call that a bit of the eroding of the entitlement. But this program really is unique to California. I've had families that I work with that move to other states, and they get on waiting lists to even begin to have a program put together to meet their needs. In California, it's an entitlement, and that means you are entitled to the services that are in your individual program plan, which we'll get into a little later, and that you don't go on a waiting list. Again, like I said, in other states, you have to be on a waiting list. You may have to be on a Medicaid waiver program and wait to get on that for quite some time before you get service. So despite a lot of the complaints that I hear, obviously, about the regional center system, it really is the best system. Okay, so regional centers really administer two programs. A lot of people are not aware of that. And the early start, early intervention is for children ages 0 to 3. And there's a different criteria for being eligible for that program. Some of you folks, your family members, may have been eligible for that program. And then there's a separate program that is for over 3. And if the individual is found eligible, and there's a different definition for the over 3 eligibility that we'll get to in a moment. If the individual is found eligible for over 3 services, then they are eligible for the rest of their life. And so that's quite a, I call it the golden ticket, that if they can get found eligible for over 3, then they have services throughout the rest of their life. Again, the Early Start program, the eligibility criteria is quite broad. It's for children younger than 3 years of age with exceptional needs who are at risk of becoming or being diagnosed as being developmentally disabled, or who have a developmental delay. They may qualify for services. So it's a much broader definition. And when I ran a regional center, only about a third of the children that we were serving in the Early Start program went on to be eligible for the over 3. And that's good news, bad news. I mean, the good news is that the individual is because of the services they received, is no longer considered developmentally disabled. The bad news is for those families, those services come to an end. And those 0 to 3 services are quite rich with OT, PT, infant stimulation, many times provided in the home. But again, those services can result in the individual not being diagnosed as developmentally disabled when they reach the age of 3 because of those services. So the services are based on the child's assessed need. And as I said, it can be OT, PT, speech, language. And then just prior to the age of 3, and actually it can go up till 5 now, there is a determination as to whether the individual is going to be considered developmentally disabled. And the definition for that is the disability must begin and be documented prior to the age of 18, expected to continue indefinitely, and constitutes a substantial disability for the individual. And that's an important part of the criteria that we'll get to in a moment. So the disabilities that are included under the developmental disability include intellectual disability, cerebral palsy, epilepsy, autism, or a disabling condition closely related to an intellectual disability or requiring treatment similar to that required for individuals with an intellectual disability. We refer to that as the 5th category. And it's a category that it's a little fuzzier as to who's eligible for that. And unfortunately, many times those end up in fair hearings as to whether the person's going to be eligible under the 5th category because they don't fit cleanly into one of the first 4 categories. So disability, this is important, that disabilities that are not a developmental disability, and therefore excluded to be served by the regional center are conditions that are solely learning disabilities or mental health disabilities or physical in nature, except for cerebral palsy. So I have lots of clients that come to me and they maybe had IEPs with learning disabilities or ADHD or mental health, emotionally ED, eligibility in special ed. If that's the only disability the child has or the individual has, they're not eligible for regional center. However, there's nothing to say that a person with autism or with an intellectual disability can't also have an overlay, for instance, of mental health. So we refer to those as folks that are duly diagnosed. Okay, my slide's not moving for some reason. Well, my screen has frozen. I may have to get out of this and go back in. Hang on, folks.
Okay, while you're doing that, I'll just pull it up as well and see if you're totally frozen, then I can run it for you, Jim.
Yeah, it is totally, that is very strange. I can't even get out of the, well, that's never happened. Let me stop sharing and then.
Yeah, stop sharing and go back in.
And then I'll go back in. Now, share the screen. Okay, go back in and go to current slide. Okay, good.
Good, okay.
Okay, so as I said before, the first step is to have one of those disabilities, but then that disability must result in what's called a substantial disability, a significant functional limitation in one or more of the following areas. Now, for an adult, it's all 7 of these. For someone that's not yet an adult, the last 2 bullets are not considered. So again, an individual must have the diagnosis, let's say autism, and then that autism has to significantly limit them in self-care, receptive and expressive language, learning, mobility, self-direction, capacity for independent living, and economic self-sufficiency. For an adult, they have to have a significant functional limitation in 3 of those 7. But for someone who's not an adult, the last 2 bullets don't apply because they're not going to be living independently. And economic self-sufficiency means their ability to work. So in some ways, it becomes more difficult for those under 18 because they have to have 3 of 5 areas that are affected by their disability in order to be eligible for regional centers. So this is a part of the definition or the eligibility criteria that many people are unaware of. Okay, so let's talk about what to do if you think your middle high school child might qualify for the regional center. Well, the first thing I think I would ask is many times individuals have been found eligible for regional center in their younger years. It's just that the regional center is not providing any services to them because they're receiving special education. And therefore, their case may be what's called inactivated. Their case is not closed, but their case may be inactivated. And if that's the case, then all it takes is a phone call to the regional center to say, my adult child now, or even at 17 or whatever, needs services, or we need to begin planning for services for my middle or high school child. And I have families that come to me that they don't realize that the case that their child was found eligible, let's say 4 or 5, because they entered school, never received services from the regional center. The case was inactivated. There was no service coordinator assigned to them, but all it takes to reactivate the case is a phone call. So that's the first thing I would say, is check to see if in fact the case has just been inactivated and in fact your child was found eligible years ago. If they weren't, if they've never been in the regional center system and you're approaching for the first time, what I suggest is that you gather all the information that you have regarding your child's diagnosis. And the best places are special education, if your child is in special ed, and they most likely will need to be in order to qualify. Any psychological assessments that have been done, either by the school or even privately, and then any doctor and therapy records. Gather those together, because that's going to be the first step in the regional center deciding if they should continue assessing your child for eligibility. So the other thing is that if there's any information, again, that shows that that diagnosis functionally affects your child in 3 of those 5 areas that I mentioned, be sure you provide that. And many times the psych assessments or the special ed records may in fact talk about how functionally that disability affects the child. And so to provide that kind of record is really important. What you want to do is determine also which regional center services your child may need at this time, because that's one of the things the regional center is going to ask you when you contact them is, well, if we made your child eligible for a regional center, what is it that we could do for them? And we'll go through some of the services a little bit later in the presentation. But for instance, maybe they need independent living skills training. Maybe you as a family need respite, or maybe your child's is leaving the school system, entering into more of an employment situation, and is going to need supported employment or a job coach. So it's important that you have an idea of what services the regional center provides, which I say we'll get to in a moment. And that when asked that question, you can say, yeah, he's going to need ILS, or he's going to need respite or supported employment. So what you want to do, of course, is contact the regional center that services your area. And as I showed you on their map, there's 21 regional centers. So you can go actually to the DDS website, Department of Developmental Services website, and you can click on regional centers, and it'll allow you to go and see all 21 regional centers and the counties that they serve. And so obviously contact the regional center that services your area. Now, the first thing that you'll do when you contact the regional center is submit all of this documentation that you have gathered, because that's the first thing most regional center intake departments will say is, well, do you have some psych reports? Do you have special ed reports? Please submit those. You send those over, and those are then reviewed by the regional center to see if the regional center wants to take the next step, which would be to assign an intake social worker that would then contact you, set up an appointment to meet with you to gather more information about your child and the function and their developmental history throughout the years, because that's important for them to gather that information in determining eligibility. So there'll probably be some more questions about that later on, but anyway, I wanted to hit on that because I know that was something that was of interest to you folks. Okay, so what is the regional center's responsibilities? Regional centers, as I said before, do not provide direct services. Instead, they identify, approve, and fund community services. That's called a vendorization process. Regional centers must pursue all possible sources of funding before they get their checkbook out and pay for things. That's under their regulations. I know sometimes the parents get upset that the regional center says, well, you should first check with your private health insurance for that, or you should check with education or Medi-Cal or IHSS. Regional center is required to tap into any of those other what's called generic resources before they pay for anything. They're considered, as that last dot says, payer of last resort. Okay, so how are regional center services determined? They're determined through a process they call the Individual Program Plan Process, IPP, very similar to the IEPs that you have in special ed. And as I said before, the services that are in the IPP are the entitlement. You are entitled to the services that are in the IPP. The individual is not entitled to every service the regional center can provide, because there's hundreds of services, but through the process of determining the services needed by that individual, that goes into the IPP, that becomes what's called the entitlement for that person. The philosophy of the regional center is to provide services that will allow a consumer's life to approximate that of his or her same age non-disabled peers. And as I said before, services can vary from one center to another. Now, if you happen to move from one regional center catchment area to another, you don't have to go through the eligibility process again. The way the regulations are written is that the receiving regional center should implement the services that were approved in the sending regional center's IPP until a new IPP meeting can be held in that receiving regional center's area. Now, sometimes the receiving regional center just doesn't have the same service, and so they may call for an IPP meeting immediately to identify what services they do have that can meet the needs of the consumer. So who's on the IPP planning team? The consumer, if it's an adult, a parent, if it's a child or a conservator of the adult, and the service coordinator or other representative from the regional center. So there can be as few as 2 people on an IPP meeting, but there can also be many, many people. It can include family members, friends, neighbors, coworkers, service providers, support persons, or any individual invited by the consumer or the authorized representative. And so you want everyone that knows that consumer and knows what their needs are to attend that meeting, because it's the time when everybody puts their heads together, identifies what the needs are, and then how those needs can be met. So what are the required components of the IPP? All services provided through a regional center are based upon assessed need. I'll have some families come to me and they'll say, God, we've been wanting independent living skills forever, but they just won't give it. And the first question, the regional center won't give it. And the first question I'll say is, well, did you ask for an assessment to see if Johnny needs independent living skills? Because everything that the regional center considers paying for has to be based upon assessed need. So ask for that assessment as the first step. And then that assessment will tell us if that service is needed and also the amount of service that may be needed. How many hours, for instance, are needed to meet the needs? The IPP will also have the goals, the short-term objectives, and then again, the services and supports to achieve those goals and objectives, whether or not it's funded by the regional center or not. The IPP is a very broad, comprehensive document and covers areas that the regional center doesn't pay for. They'll ask about, is Johnny seeing the dentist every month? Did he apply for SSI? Is he seeing a doctor? What's his living arrangement? Some of those things regional centers can pay for, some of those things they can't. But the regional center is to be very comprehensive in writing the IPP and reviewing all of the needs of the consumer. Now, IPPs can be done on either a 1, 2, or 3-year cycle. And technically, the IPP team should really determine if it's necessary for that meeting, that IPP meeting, to occur every 1 year, every 2 years, or every 3 years. However, if it's determined that it's going to be every 2 years or every 3 years, there still is what's called an annual meeting that's held on the 2nd and the 3rd. So in other words, there's always going to be a meeting every year, but a full-blown IPP meeting may not be held every year. Okay, so I don't know, some of you folks may have special needs trusts for your children, adult or minor children. And we had a situation where a regional center asked for a copy of the special needs trust of the individual, their consumer. The regional center read that trust, and if you've seen special needs trusts, they are quite broad in what they can pay for. And this particular regional center said, we're not going to pay for anything because this person has a special needs trust that can pay for all these things. We took that all the way up the appeal ladder and in front of an administrative law judge, and we prevailed in that hearing, in that the judge said that while the regional centers are required to tap into any other generic resources like I listed before, whether it be Department of Rehabilitation or IHSS or Medi-Cal or Medicare or private health insurance, whatever, they can't require that the special needs trust pay for things. They have to pay before the special needs trust pays. So that was a huge victory. And on occasion, we will have a regional center start to make some noise about that same issue. And I'll just shoot them out a copy of the administrative law judge's decision. And he did a really great job of documenting the legislative intent of what regional centers are for and what they should pay for. And it's documented really well to say that the regional centers do have to pay before a trust pays. And so we've been able to push back on any regional center that brings up that topic. And so far, no regional center has taken us back to fair hearing on that. Okay, there's a really great way, some of you may be aware of this, of getting a consumer of the regional center on Medi-Cal who's under 18 years of age. As I think most of you know, when an individual is under 18, from all financially means tested benefits, the parent's income and resources are counted. And so many times then the child isn't eligible for Medi-Cal. And Medi-Cal can be very important for lots of reasons, for medical health coverage, but also, as that bottom dot says, you got to be on Medi-Cal if you want IHSS, in-home support services. So the way this works is the regional center consumer, they have to be not in the early start program. They have to be in the over 3 program. So they're age 3 to 18. They have to be receiving at least one service funded by the regional center. This gets sort of into the weeds a little bit, but what happens is the regional center places that child onto what's called a DDS Medicaid waiver, and the regional center requests that the local Medi-Cal agency institutionally deem the child on the Medi-Cal by only looking at the child's income and resources, not the parents. And usually the child doesn't have much income or doesn't have many resources, so they're found eligible for Medi-Cal. Whereas if the parents' income and resources were considered, they wouldn't have been found eligible. So that's a really neat way of getting many of our minor children onto Medi-Cal. And again, it's important many times because of the IHSS that is required, that it's required that you be on Medi-Cal in order to apply for in-home support services. Okay, so what are some of the services regional centers can provide? And again, it's based upon assessed need. It's not a menu that all regional centers get. Board and care homes. One of the biggest ticket items when I was running a regional center was board and care. Regional centers pay a huge amount for monthly costs of a board and care home. Now, an individual does have to have their SSI check go to the board and care home, but then the regional center makes up the difference, and it can be thousands and thousands of dollars. Now, there are sometimes consumers that have more medical needs, and the regional center assists in placing them into what's called intermediate care facilities, and those are funded by Medi-Cal, but the regional center assists in that placement. There's a service called supported living services, which I always refer to as the real Cadillac. And this is where a consumer living in their own residence can have the regional center pay for staff that will support that individual up to 24 hours a day. So in other words, the individual, the house, the residence is not paid for by the regional center, has to be paid for by the family, or sometimes 2 or 3 consumers get together and use their SSI money and rent a place, although in many areas, particularly the Bay Area, that becomes very expensive to do. So it usually comes down to those families that can afford to have a separate residence for their disabled regional center adult consumer to live in. But if they can swing that, then the regional center can pay for staff to be in that home up to 24 hours a day. When I ran a regional center, we had about 250 of our consumers in supported living. And in some cases, we had 24/7, 2-on-1 for some consumers that needed that. There also are family home agency, which is sort of like foster family. And also independent living skills training that I talked about before is a service that prepares an individual, a consumer, to live out on their own if they can learn the skills necessary. But if they can't learn those independent living skills training, those independent living skills, then that's when the supported living services kick in. So usually what we do first is we have an assessment done, like I said before, for any service, have an ILS, independent living skills training assessment done, have the independent living skills training provided to the consumer. If they can't learn all the skills they need to live safely and successfully on their own, then that's when supported living services can kick in to provide those services that the individual was not able to learn. Some other regional center services: in-home respite gives a break to the parents from the responsibility and the stress of caring for their disabled family member. There can be out-of-home respite. Now, that's usually provided in a board and care home. So up to 21 days a year, the family can go on vacation or whatever, and the consumer can be in a board and care home if there's a vacancy in the board and care home. That's usually the trick, though, is to find an open bed in a board and care home so that out-of-home respite can be provided. Regional center can provide transportation services to the various programs that they fund, such as adult day programs. Supported employment is a really neat one. Regional centers have a cooperative agreement with the local Department of Rehabilitation. So if the regional center has a consumer that has a goal of becoming employed, then the regional center makes a referral to the Department of Rehab. Years and years ago, I handled that caseload at Department of Rehab. The Department of Rehab opens the case, writes a plan with that individual, and if that individual, in order to hold a job, needs a job coach to be with them, initially maybe full-time, and then decrease down to once a week or a couple times a week or whatever, for the job coach to be in that employment situation with them. If that job coach can't be withdrawn totally after about 60 or 90 days, then the funding for that job coach transitions back to the regional center, and that job coach can be paid for by the regional center for the rest of the time that the consumer has that job. So it's a nice cooperative agreement that regional centers have with the local Department of Rehabilitation. Now, behavioral services is something that changed a bit number of years ago, and it is required that families first tap into their private health insurance, and private health insurance is now required to provide behavioral services. So that's one of those generic resources now that regional centers turn to. There's a new program, or relatively new, called self-determination. Some of you may have heard about this. This is a different way of receiving services through the regional center that doesn't work for all families. I'm working with some families that's working great. Other families, it just doesn't work. There's no benefit, or some families that get into it and then they want to back out. And what it is an alternative. It's a new way for regional centers to fund services. Before, as I mentioned, regional centers usually vendorize services. In other words, they approve a vendor to provide certain services, and then they pay that vendor to provide those services. In this self-determination program, the amount of money that the regional center has spent on that consumer, or will need to spend on that consumer, is all added up, and that becomes a budget. So that second dot, a budget is agreed upon based upon what's in the current IPP, how much the regional center has spent on that consumer for the last 12 months. You identify any unmet needs, how much those would cost the regional center to provide in what's called the traditional way. And then you decide on how all that money is going to be spent. Now, the money is not given to the consumer. The money is not given to the parents. It is handled by what's called an FMS, Financial Management Services. It's an entity that is required to handle the money. So they get the money, and they are the ones that spend the money according to the spending plan that's been approved. And where self-determination really is, the beauty of it is in the spending plan. So after you've come up with all the money and that budget, and we always try to make that pot of money as big as we can by identifying all the needs that this consumer needs, then you enter into developing the spending plan. And the spending plan, again, is how you're going to spend the money. And you don't have to use vendors of the regional center. you can use anyone that you want. If Johnny wants to, learn a trade, and you've got someone down the street who can teach him that trade, or someone down the street who can provide some sort of service for Johnny, and they're not vendorized, they don't want to go through the rigmarole of being vendorized, the FMS could pay that person to help Johnny. Also, you can pay more than the established rate. So many times we have problems with services that the staff is just not being paid enough to attract qualified workers. Under self-determination, you can determine how much those individuals are going to be paid. Now, you still got to live within your budget, so you've got to be careful of that. So again, higher rates can be provided to service providers, but again, you must live within your budget.
Dinero que es más alto, ¿no?
I think I'm hearing the Spanish interpretation all of a sudden. Oh, now it's gone. Okay. Okay, that's basically it.
Okay, thank you very much, Jim. We appreciate that, and we appreciate your time. Thank you, Beatrice. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and have
Thanks,
a good night.
Melissa. Thank
Take
you.
care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.